Mrs. Bentley wore drab clothes, browns, olives, grays, washing out her already pale skin. Her hair was pulled back and sprayed with hairspray, lacquer-like, to her head. The only feminine thing about her was her long, bright red nails, the kind that needed attending to. Mrs. Bentley was tall and crisp and dishwater blonde. She didn't wear glasses, but she should have, to sternly look over the children that she worked with. She had 30 children in her class, 7-year-olds. Sometimes she spoke to them through her clenched teeth. She always spoke to Joseph this way. He was the darkest boy in her class. He had inappropriate comments for everything. His behavior was sporadic. His dark eyes flashed as if he challenged her authority at every turn. He was noisy and clamoring, sarcastic, and 7. He was a torment that apparently happened to her every day. When they talked about animals, he'd punctuate the discussion with animal sounds. He couldn't sit still. He flashed his brilliant white teeth to the class and a silent display of rebellion anytime he was punished. Whatever his indiscretion or clownish class interruption, punishment or threats, or when threats and punishment came, Joseph would sit back and smile triumphantly. Miss Bentley had had meetings with Joseph's mother, Mrs. Garcia. She was a large, mild woman, soft-spoken, level-headed. It was always hard for her not to smirk when her son's misadventures were spelled out to her. All right, I understand. I'll deal with it, she would say. But Mrs. Bentley knew that nothing would happen, assumed that nothing would happen. This was a little monster that had to be stopped. Day by day, troubles continued, and then one afternoon, Mrs. Bentley left the room. And Joseph decided to take the class hostage as she left. He jumped on his desk and shouted, holding an imaginary gun, "Hold it, you little assholes! You're all under arrest!" and started shooting at invisible bullets throughout the classroom. Everybody, change their seats. Everybody, change your seats. Raise your hands to the air. The girls squealed. The boys laughed and howled, bending over with laughter, changing their seats. Joe sprayed the class holding an imaginary gun. The kids laughed and sneakily changed seats one at a time, playing along, all of them bending and moaning and pretending like they were shot. Miss Bentley entered the room with the pandemonium engaged. She violently grabbed Joseph by his arm and flung him off the desk, scratching his arm and drawing blood. His young body hit the floor violently. He was not smiling now. She screamed at him and dragged him by the collar into the hallway, tossed him into a chair. Missing it, he slid into the wall and hit his head. "You're not smiling right now, are you?" She screamed at the other children to come to order. "This is what happens to people like you. This is what happens to your kind," she said. Joseph pulled himself up and sat in the chair, still. The day end was strangely quiet. The children didn't make a sound. They didn't respond to questions. They didn't look at Miss Bentley as she spoke. Joseph didn't move from his chair in the hall until the principal roughly brought him to the office. Mrs. Garcia was called again. Once she was there, she was astonished to see her son's arms bleeding, his forehead bruised. She took her son to the hospital at once. She called the school. "He's a bad kid," Mrs. Bentley said. "What about his arm? You broke his skin with your nails. He's got bruises. It was an accident." "You call bruising up a 7-year-old an accident?" "What did I say? He's a troubled kid. It was an accident." Mrs. Bentley was firm. She knew that she had tenure. Mrs. Garcia, the principal interjected, "We have to suspend your child for 3 days. His behavior has caused a lot of damage in the school." "I see." Joseph did not go to school for 3 days. And surprisingly, when he returned to school, he had a broken spirit. He looked out the window most of the time. The first day after school, his mother expected for him to tell her a tale of how things went, for him to be himself, but he wasn't himself. He looked down and shrugged. The second day, she expected things to change, but that morning he took his lunch, kissed her on the head, and for the first time didn't look in her eyes. It went on like that for weeks. He was ashamed. He was broken. Joseph went to school as told. He sat quietly in his seat and he stared out the window. Mrs. Garcia knocked at the classroom door one morning at about 11 a.m. Miss Bentley came over after a long delay and said, "What do you want now, Mrs. Garcia? Your child is finally under control." "In the hall, please," Mrs. Garcia said. "We are in session. You can speak to me later." Mrs. Bentley walked away from Mrs. Garcia. "Please, speak to me in the hall, Miss Bentley." Mrs. Garcia spoke with her firm yet soft tone. "Did you hear what I said? Are you like him? Did you hear what I said? We are in session. Please," Mrs. Garcia said softly. "All right, what?" Mrs. Bentley walked to the doorway, opened the door. She went to the doorway and walked into the hall with her hand on her hip. "I think you should apologize to my son for damaging him. You physically hurt him, you roughed him up, you scratched his arm, you drew blood. I think it would be better for him if you just apologized, don't you?" "I told you it was an accident. Didn't I tell you that it was an accident?" "Oh, it was an accident? And since you're the adult, you don't apologize? Your son is a menace, do you understand? Anyway, there's no way I'm apologizing. Do you understand me?" Mrs. Bentley's voice was shrill. "I see." Mrs. Garcia watched Miss Bentley strut back into her classroom. With that, Miss Garcia pulled the back of her collar, pulled her all the way back so that her face hit hard on the ground. When she came back up, Mrs. Bentley was punched squarely in the jaw by Mrs. Garcia. Mrs. Garcia almost knocked her out. "Oh, I am so sorry," Mrs. Garcia said. "That was an accident."
That's right.
Woo! Do you see how easy it is to say you're sorry? With that, she took Joseph from school.